Long ago, as humanity was just learning how to walk upright, a certain accident was made on the other end of the universe. In the few years that followed, hundreds of planets were wiped out, and even the Kaioshin, the Lord of Lords in the divine hierarchy, were almost eradicated as a result. So who was at fault, you ask? Bibidi the Warlock was the culprit. And what was the mistake? Majin Buu, a monster designed to slaughter and destroy. After defeating the majority of the universe's Kaioshin, Buu was sealed by Bibidi, who locked the monster away out of fear of what it would do next. Of course, this explanation all meant absolutely nothing to Goku, who happened to be visiting Earth on the day that Buu returned, but who could blame him? The Kaioshin who were defeated might have been strong enough to beat Frieza in a single blow, but who isn't at this point? I mean, Trunks did that 100 chapters ago, and it's implied that Goku would have been able to do something similar if he had made it back to Earth from Yardrat in time, but that aside, Boo's backstory isn't really meant to impress, because it's just like everything else in this chapter range, designed to lull our heroes into a false sense of security. The word that describes the early sections of the Buu saga best is hubris. After all, what were Goku, Gohan, Vegeta, and the others all doing before this? The tournament they were fighting in was going to be a cinch. With the three Saiyans in the running, even people like 18, Krillin, and Piccolo were basically competing for 4th and 5th place. Even with Goku and Vegeta getting matched up against each other in the first round, one of these three was practically guaranteed to win. So why worry about this new threat when Buu was introduced as vaguely stronger than Frieza, someone who had been absolutely left in the dust at this point? Even as things start to escalate, there's always a reasonable excuse for whatever happens. Gohan gets his energy stolen? Well, he was off guard and it was all part of Shin's plan anyway. Don't worry about Vegeta saying Gohan got weaker during the peacetime, who cares? He's still more than strong enough to handle whatever happens, he beat Cell. Goku and Vegeta are probably stronger than him now anyway, so even if he gets overwhelmed, they're right there. Piccolo and Krillin get turned into stone by Dabura? They weren't going to be doing much anyways. In fact, when's the last time they did anything? What do you mean Piccolo could have been the voice of reason as things escalated later? Is he even stronger than first form Cell? Sounds pretty useless to me. These issues of course pile up over time, turning our hero's strong points into weaknesses. Piccolo and Krillin aren't available to give their input and Kibito is dead, leaving Shin as the lone voice of reason as things progress. Now the Saiyans gapping everyone else power-wise is a huge problem because when Goku and Vegeta decide to fight at the expense of the world, nobody can stop them. On top of that, with these two occupied, Gohan's earlier weakness that Vegeta cited is now even further exposed, leading to the worst possible scenario, Babidi's success and Buu's emergence. So what's the word? Malachi here, I talk about manga. When it comes to breaking down what exactly makes Buu the most unique villain in the post-time skip, it's hard to know where to start. There's his malleability, whether we're talking about physically, character-wise, or plot-wise. There's his dynamic with Goku, Goten, and Trunks. There's his meta-contextual relationship with Toriyama, who is building towards the definitive end of Dragon Ball. We'll touch on all those things, but I want to start by comparing him to what we've seen before from previous villains. In another video, I spoke about Buu being a subversion wrapped up in another subversion, but for us to get into what that really means, we have to start with the basics. First, Buu has been on Earth hidden for a long time. Longer than Vegeta, longer than Goku, and maybe even longer than the Namekian that would go on to become Kami and Piccolo. This establishes him as the fundamental inverse of all these characters. While the planet was being attacked by invaders, people like Raditz, Vegeta, Nappa, Frieza, and even Goku himself, Buu was hidden somewhere the entire time, waiting to emerge. Even his seal, which really could have been any shape, is intentionally a warped looking sphere, which broadens these comparisons to the point of even including Cell. Look at the seal and the egg that Cell came out of side by side, especially after they've both split in half. Cell's from the future and Buu is from the past, but both characters end up underground once they reach the present. So immediately, just by taking like a surface level look at Buu's background, we learn what kind of character he's gonna be. Cell's connection to past villains are neat, segmented off, and easy to spot. He's like Vegeta during this chapter range, and then he's like Frieza during these fights, and then he's like Piccolo here. Buu, on the other hand, somehow manages to call back to every villain at once while also being their direct opposite in some ways. He's a subversion. Let's take it a step further. Buu is simultaneously more active than Piccolo, Vegeta, Frieza, and Cell while also somehow being presented as passive on the surface level. So what do I mean by that? Shin says that Buu was created by Bibidi, which sounds very similar to how Dr. Gero created Cell. Both Babidi and Jiro also want revenge on Shin and Goku, so this makes both Buu and Cell the physical results of someone else's efforts towards vengeance, which would make them passive characters in a way, but when you look closer there are clear differences between these two. Dr. Jiro has the direct link to the main cast through the Red Ribbon Army. He intentionally observed our heroes, stole their DNA, then designed Cell top to bottom. Babidi, on the other hand, is an entirely new character with no links to anybody outside of the storyline. He's Shin's old enemy, Babidi's predecessor, Buu's alleged creator and the architect of the seal, but we don't know anything about any of these things before Shin explains them to Goku. The fact that Toriyama would later go on to confirm that Buu actually existed before Babidi helps this idea even more. While Cell's origins are grounded and organic, very connected to the story that we've seen before, Buu's are essentially a contrivance designed to force him into this world while somehow managing to not come off that way. The true order of things starts to become clear though when the seal is broken and Buu appears. Immediately, Babidi establishes himself as Buu's master, which creates a dynamic that we've all seen before in this series. Piccolo, Vegeta, Frieza, and Cell all had servants that they used in one way or another, but when you look closer, there are clear differences yet again. When have we ever seen a villain that relies on the subordinate like Babidi relies on Buu? Piccolo didn't need his children really, Vegeta didn't need Nappa or the Cybermen, Frieza didn't really need his troops, and Cell didn't need the Cell Juniors. Babidi, on the other hand, is introduced with the main goal of releasing Buu, and then of course becomes reliant on him the second he emerges to be a threat, but that's just the first layer. Buu isn't just unique in his importance to his master, he's unique in the fact that he's the opposite of an effective minion. Within chapters of his introduction, he's knocked off Babidi's two most powerful assets, Dabura and Vegeta, despite them both putting holes of different sizes in Buu. Dabura even goes as far to say what's being implied out loud himself. Buu will never really be Babidi's loyal servant. After this small seed is planted, we get more and more layered references to past villains. Just like Cell and Piccolo Daimo, Buu gets his own broadcast to the world, but he's neither the speaker nor the main focus despite being the one doing the actual destroying. There's also his general impatience and refusal to wait, which places him at odds with villains like Raditz, Vegeta, Frieza, and Cell, who were all willing to wait at times, but we'll flesh that idea out and talk about the single person who can get Buu to wait once we get into his motivations later on. For now though, there's one more through line that needs to be addressed to fully understand Buu's relationship with past villains, and that's his approach to transformation. If I were to sum up all the ideas I've covered so far in one word, it would be the word malleable. How else would you be able to write a villain that bounces between extremes in the way that Buu does without making them flexible? This is epitomized in the way that Buu changes forms. Unlike Vegeta, Frieza, and Cell, he can't transform at will, at least not initially. The transition from Fat Buu to Skinny and then into Super Buu is completely unexpected and unintentional, and most importantly, completely out of Buu's control. It may have been a power-up, but fundamentally, it's really a character moment more than anything. We'll talk about later why this character moment over power-up thing is true as well for Super Buu's absorption of Gotenks, Piccolo, and Gohan, even if those choices were intentional. But that aside, Buuhan's transition into Kid Buu is both the most important in the arc by far and completely against Buu's will. That aside, hopefully I've done a little bit to provide a foundation for today's discussion before we get into specifics when it comes to this character, but you might have also seen the title of this video and wondered about what was going on outside of the story with Toriyama around this time. Check this out. By the beginning of the Buu saga, the Dragon Ball manga had about 420 chapters and had been in serialization for almost 10 years. Around this time, Toriyama had recently been convinced to keep writing by his editors despite wanting to end the story in the previous arc. So with an author that plainly didn't think he'd still be drawing the manga at this point, the Buu saga ended up being completely different from what had come before, while also still being grounded in the context of hundreds of chapters. It's still the same manga after all. In other words, Buu's contradictory nature is simply a reflection of the strange in-between state of the story at the time he was being written, but there's more on top of that. You'd think that the Buu saga would be short, but it actually still ended up lasting 2 years, which is crazy in comparison to a modern series like JJK, which wrapped up within a year. So how did an author tired of his own story manage to keep writing for so long? Well, he did it by really writing a different kind of story with the help of his editors. As a foundation, the plot was intentionally simple, which was a stark contrast coming right out of the twists and turns of the Cell saga. Most prominently though, the tone of the Buu saga was more akin to early Dragon Ball or even Dr. Slump. I talk about the plot and tone related stuff in a context outside of Boo in that earlier Boo video I was talking about, but all those things can be seen in Boo himself because once again, he's malleable. He can be a gag character, function as a foil to the protagonist, and drive the plot as the main villain all at once, while also doing the most important thing for the story, keeping Toriyama entertained and engaged with writing it. So let's get even more specific with that in terms of Boo. I've spoken before about how Boo's introduction can be read as a joke. Toriyama's villains' designs have always been subversive, whether we want to talk about Piccolo being a slug or Vegeta being a troll doll, but Boo's initial reveal is just ridiculous. Babidi Dabura and Gohan don't know what to think, and Shin, per usual, being the only serious character, is terrified. It's really funny. In a way, this is also a reduction of Toriyama's villain introductions, as it kind of answers this question of how would characters react if they weren't taking insert villain here seriously and actually thought about how funny looking some of these designs actually are. I won't spend too much time covering every single Boo gag from this section of the story, but understand that the comedy becomes more and more prominent the deeper we get into the story and the higher the stakes get. Hercule and Boo's friendship obviously comes to mind, but on top of that, the fight between Fat and Skinny Boo is one of the more important moments in the arc, but we also get this panel of Skinny Boo running that should just completely break the tension but somehow works. On top of that, you would think Super Boo would have fewer gags with his design and all, but his fight with Gotenks is just straight up the most unserious series of chapters in the arc so far. We got Boo punching Trunks before he can start the fusion dance, he's drinking a milkshake and reading magazines mid-fight, and he's even breaking the dimensional barrier on accident because there weren't any snacks in the Room of Spirit and Time. This is all happening after nearly every human on Earth was killed, by the way. In fact, the stakes are so much higher than the previous arc that this funny fight we've been talking about is happening inside of the last refuge of our heroes that was their path to salvation in the previous arc, the Room of Spirit and Time. At this point, all the gags were straight up surprising Toriyama's editors, but they actually encouraged this new direction, knowing that keeping him interested was the best way to keep the story chugging along. I will say though, after Gohan's arrival to the battlefield, the jokes do slow down to some extent, but they never completely stop. In the manga, Vegeta vs. Buhan is almost as unserious as Gotenks vs. Super Boo. We got Boo getting a bloody nose, he's trying to sneak Vegito and getting thrashed, and of course we all remember the infamous candy gag. Even Kid Boo gets his fair share of funny choreography in the limited amount of panel time that he has, but all that aside, it's very clear that Boo fits very well into the comedy mold by design, which is pretty funny when you think about another pink, shape-shifting villain who has a sweet tooth and like pretty girls from original Dragon Ball. Now let's get into the execution of this character, his development over the course of the Boo saga, and his dynamics with the main cast. Let's start with this. Boo is a child, in the purest sense of the word. He plays pranks, he's hyper fixated on candy, and he'll stop whatever he's doing to take a nap. Boo is even described as a child directly by the narrator, and his status as a child informs the way he interacts with other characters on the most basic level. For example, people like Dabura and Vegeta find out pretty quickly that Boo's maybe the easiest person to rage bait in the entire series. On the other end of things, people like the blind boy and the girl from the city find out that Boo responds pretty well to compliments and kindness. Babidi, kind of in between these two extremes, as Boo's unofficial parent in a way, forces him to comply with the carrot and the stick. On one hand, he's got the threat of resealing Boo away, and on the other hand, he's got the motivation of allowing Boo to fight, destroy, and eat pretty much whenever he wants. Boo also treats combat like a game. All of his early fights are back and forth. In his brief fight with Gohan, for example, he lets Gohan run, then outspeeds him kind of like a little kid playing tag. Immediately after, he straight up lets Shin hit him with a Kai, then does it right back but bigger. His fight with Goku is in a similar vein to these two things, but we'll talk more about that later on. Overall, Boo is pretty simple in terms of motivations, kind of like a child would be. He wants to eat, sleep, have fun, and be recognized by others. So that's some of the surface level stuff, but a few other details begin to form a bigger, more inclusive picture of Boo. For example, when you pay attention, it's clear that Boo is the source of constant misconceptions and confusion in the story itself. Some are obvious. Babidi, for example, doesn't know what Boo looks like before he comes out the seal. Vegeta, on the other hand, thinks Boo killed Gohan and passes this false idea on to the rest of the cast. Even later on, Piccolo thinks Boo had more time than he did on the lookout because he forgot how the Room of Spirit and Time works. These mix-ups get resolved, but what about the ones that don't? For example, Shin describes Boo as a force of destruction with neither reason nor emotion, but we clearly see that that isn't true. Boo might not be the smartest, but he picks things up pretty quickly and even outmaneuvers Babidi eventually. Him having emotion is even easier to prove. He gets angry when insulted, crows when complimented, and forms a genuine bond with Hercule and his dog. But these contradictions don't just boil down to Shin being wrong for no reason. He just wasn't referring to the right Boo when he made that statement. This is where things start to become even more nuanced. What are the differences between the original, most difficult Boo and the one we meet on Earth? What about the Boos that get introduced in between these two? This is where the meat of Boo's character can be found, which brings us to his dynamic with other characters. For example, almost in direct defiance to all the in-story misconceptions I covered so far, Goten and Trunks are pretty much right on the money when it comes to Boo fundamentally. Goku, Vegeta, and Gohan may all write off this new villain in different ways, but Goten and Trunks get word of what's going on and immediately expect to meet a genie when they arrive. This is the beginning of one of the more important dynamics in this storyline. And as things progress, we get more callbacks to earlier scenes, like Trunks rushing in to save Vegeta from Boo. Just like pretty much everything else in this arc though, the scene is twisted into a contrast to the scene from the Cell Saga, with Vegeta actually fighting for decent reasons this time around instead of just pride. Of course though, the main difference here is that Vegeta won't be making it out of this situation alive like he did against Android 18. It's also clear that Boo, Goten, and Trunks are all similarly yoked in terms of talent. All three are introduced having learned techniques that it took the older members of the cast time and effort to gain. Of course, Trunks and Goten get Super Saiyan pretty easily, but on Boo's end of things, he has an intuitive grasp of keeping his energy low until it's time to strike, kinda like the thing that Goku did on Namek against the Ginyu Force. It gets deeper than that though. Boo's ability to learn techniques after seeing them once really serves to strengthen this parallel, while also calling back to Cell and creating a contrast there at the same time. Cell knew everyone's moves naturally as a result of having their DNA, but Boo learned them over time. Pretty similar things, but different fundamentally. To sum up what I'm getting at, because Boo is a child, he has a natural dynamic with Goten and Trunks throughout the story, which of course comes to a head during Gotenks' fight with Super Boo. The parallels even continue here if you want to get meta. Some people like to critique Gotenks as being more Trunks' personality than Goten, which kinda lines up pretty well with Super Boo's personality being more skinny Boo's than fat Boo's. That all aside though, Boo's dynamic with Goten and Trunks is pretty underrated, but I think Boo's dynamic with Goku is not only much better, but also somehow even more underrated, so let's get into that next. Earlier, I introduced the idea that Shin was mischaracterizing Boo because he wasn't referring to the right version. This is an important difference. When you consider the fact that Boo fundamentally changed, was immediately put into stasis, and then was sent to Earth by Bibidi, he sounds really similar to Goku. I've said over and over again that this story takes parallels and warps them into contrast, and it's clear that this aspect of Boo's background is just like Goku's, like I said, who was sent to Earth, then fundamentally changed after he arrived and hit his head. The Saiyan Frieza and Cell sagas all see Goku reclaim his true identity as he learns about his heritage, and Boo undergoes a very similar process over the course of this arc. Just like Goten and Trunks' understanding of Boo's concept signals that there's a dynamic that we should be looking out for, Goku also understands Boo in his own way. Dabura and Vegeta motivate Boo to fight with insults. Babidi motivates him with threats. Goku, however, who was always a good judge of people, cuts through all of this and sees Boo for what he is, someone who responds well to compliments and wants entertainment. He walks him through the Super Saiyan forms. As a person who enjoys fighting the way he does, he resonates with Boo treating combat like a game, and most importantly, he really doesn't throw any insults at him. Goku understands Boo so well that he even plants the seeds for Boo's escape from Babidi, but things only get more involved in terms of these two's dynamic from here. The transition between Fat Boo and Super Boo is another clear point of comparison. We've seen Goku lose control of his anger before on several occasions, but Boo's fight with himself is as on the nose as it gets. Boo straight up physically loses to a manifestation of his anger and gets absorbed by it. It's at this point that we start to see Boo's motivation shift yet again. Now he's not just looking for entertainment, he's actively pursuing strength, but not in the same way as Goku did. Boo is less worried about self-improvement and more focused on keeping his spot at the top of the power scale, something that we know is just impossible for somebody to do in the type of story that Dragon Ball is. Boo likes to fight, but not really when he's on the back foot, and only so that he can have somebody to beat up with his power. According to Boo himself, at this point winning is everything, and we see him do things like trying to take out Goku before he confused with Gohan, or claiming that Vegito is unfair because he's two people. On the meta end of things, the fandom's critiques of this villain also start to ramp up around this point, especially after he starts absorbing people left and right. The common thoughts on Boo at this point are that he loses his personality and becomes boring, but I think Boo becoming worse over the course of these chapters is completely intentional. In the pursuit of power, a journey primarily motivated by the soul filled with rage that Piccolo refers to, Boo just loses himself, merging with just about anybody who can give him an edge. At this point, he doesn't even care about Hercule. But all of these developments are meant to demonstrate a very important idea. Not all surroundings create the same effects for different people. Someone like Goku was able to thrive on Earth because he met the right people like Roshi Kami and all of his friends. Boo, on the other hand, gets some of the worst that humanity can offer as soon as he emerges. The panel of Piccolo looking down on Boo, just like how Kami looked down on the androids in Cell, says it all. There is still a threat is such an ambiguous statement, but I interpret this as Piccolo seeing the humans who were going to kill Boo's dog and hurt Hercule. In this case, the Earth itself becomes a threat in a way, as Boo, being a child and all, is incredibly malleable, that word just keeps coming back, and responsive to his surroundings. If he's introduced to evil, he'll match it just as quickly as he matched Goku's Kamehameha, or Gohan's speed, or Shen's Kai. He's a mirror in that way, reflecting back everything that surrounds him, even the story itself. With that in mind, what needs to happen for Boo next? Well, clearly he needs to remove himself from the influences that are distancing him from his true identity, which brings us to Kid Boo. So let me ask a question. Is being true to yourself always a good thing? It's clear that Boo has been in flux over the course of the storyline, but would it automatically be a good thing for him to revert to how he used to be originally? The Boo saga, unlike any other arc in Dragon Ball, is all about what it means to be good. Babidi is a warlock, and his ability to control the evil in a person's heart makes it essential that our heroes be good. The first thing that Shin does when he meets Goku is read his heart, after all. But this doesn't quite line up with the idea of self-discovery being a fundamentally good thing that's been established in earlier storylines. The lines blur even more when you consider how the narrator describes Fat Boo after his anger leaves his body. He's the sweet Boo, the one who doesn't stand a chance against the wrathful skinny Boo. Even Super Boo, the result of Boo being swallowed by his own anger, is reluctant to let the representation of that sweetness go, as he, quote, won't be himself anymore after Vegeta rips Fat Boo out of him. If Boo were just a straight up parallel to Goku, he'd be presented to be headed in the right direction as he reverts to his original form, but the transition into Kid Boo is more of a neutral thing for the character with its own nuances. Fundamentally though, the most important thing happening here is that Boo is now the way he was before he came to Earth, separated from most of the influences that have dictated his actions up to this point. So let's talk about what happens next. First, it's made clear that although Boo has reverted back to his original form, he still has some traits that we've become familiar with. In fact, in some cases, they're outright magnified. Boo is at his most impatient as Kid Boo. Super Boo might not have wanted to wait the full hour for Goten and Trunks, but Kid Boo refuses to even wait a moment before trying to blow up the Earth. Even Goku's tactic of proposing a fight, the idea that worked on Fat Boo, mind you, fails, and just like that, everything is gone. Up to this point, there's been a subtle build-up to the planet possibly being destroyed. Babidi was specifically having Fat Boo hold back so that he wouldn't do it outright. Super Boo chose to snipe every human on the Earth from the lookout instead of blowing up the planet, most likely to spare Hercule. Later on, during his fight with Gotenks, he shoots a blast that would have wiped the planet away without a trace, according to Piccolo. After absorbing Gotenks, things escalate further as Boo outright tries to destroy the planet once before Goku arrives, then a second time after absorbing Vegito. In other words, there have been these constant near scrapes with the Earth almost being destroyed, but Kid Boo immediately puts the end to all of that and just blows it up on introduction. After this, we learned yet another thing about Kid Boo. He's still just as good at learning techniques as he was before. After watching Kibito Kai teleport, he immediately picks up the move and follows Goku and the others. So a few questions here. One, even if Shin was referring to Kid Boo when he made his no emotion or reason statement, he's clearly still off the mark. If Boo were just destroying planets on autopilot, he would have no reason to follow Goku or Vegeta. He doesn't have any reason. Any logical reason you can think of, like Boo not feeling like the Earth was fully destroyed and so everybody who was on the planet was dead, is a reason, which goes against what Shin said earlier. So if Boo clearly has reason, what was his reason? Personally, I think proving that Kid Boo has reason period is more important than getting into the specifics, but as we get more context on how this version of Boo thinks during his fight with Goku, we see that he just outright goes to sleep while Goku and Vegeta are deciding who's gonna go first. Does this sound like somebody who's just constantly destroying things on autopilot without worrying about anything else? Goku himself says that it looks like Boo is bored, but after Super Saiyan 3 comes out, he's downright excited for the fight. Pretty clear. It turns out that this version of Boo likes combat as much as any other version, and he even picks up Goku's Kamehameha again. It's at this point that we need to talk about an aspect of Boo's abilities that I've waited to mention until now: his regeneration. Over the course of this arc, Boo has been practically invincible. Vegeta couldn't blow him up, Gotenks couldn't burn him to cinders, and even Vegeta, who seemed to be able to disintegrate Boo, couldn't do so before rescuing everybody he had absorbed. Note that I understand that there were points in time where Boo's chances of winning were ambiguous, like his fight with Goku initially, or points where he was outright on the back foot, like the last part of his fight with Gotenks or his fight with Gohan. What I'm getting at is that in a meta sense, writing a villain who can recover from just about any injury instantly makes it clear that they're not going to go down until they're exactly where the story needs them to be, which brings us to the Spirit Bomb. So why does Goku lose to Boo in Super Saiyan 3? Well, it's pretty obvious that Goku just coming back into the story and beating Boo up by himself just wouldn't feel right after everything that's happened, but it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. From his introduction, Boo has never really fought alone. He's always had the Lord of Lords inside of him, or later on, Gotenks and Gohan. After reverting, he was the closest to being alone he had ever been in the storyline, and as a result, Toriyama put him up against the character with the most connections in the series, Goku. That's why Goku and Vegeta refused to fuse early on, and maybe even why Goku starts talking crazy about how he really could have beaten Fat Boo earlier. There needs to be a contrast established between fighting alone and fighting with help. Goku himself even recognizes that Boo is admirable for fighting alone. Also, in the midst of all this, we get a fight between Kid Boo and Fat Boo, yet another physical representation of an idea that's been stressed during this arc. On one end, we have Fat Boo, who's now been shaped by his environment twice over. He was changed by the Kaioshin, and then he was changed again by Earth later on. Both changes were for the better. On the other end, we have Kid Boo, who hasn't had the opportunity to be changed by much of anything outside of Bibidi. This raises the question, who would Boo become if he had the same opportunities to grow as someone like Goku did? Of course, Goku, being extremely perceptive as usual, picks this up and asks for Boo to be revived, bringing this whole thing full circle. So with all that being said, hopefully some of these ideas help to explain why Boo is such an underrated villain. The way I see it, Dragon Ball is good the whole way through, and all of its major villains are extremely contentious in terms of who's the best one. So as somebody who thinks that way, of course I'm going to say that Boo isn't an exception to that rule, and I haven't seen many people talk about him in a holistic manner, so I wanted to give it a shot myself. If you made it this far into the video, thank you for watching. I've been enjoying analyzing these characters, so you can expect more videos like this in the future, and of course, subscribe if you haven't yet. But other than that, have a good day.